everyone, my name is Jamie. Welcome back to my channel. Today I wanted to just kind of impromptu talk about something that's been going on for the past couple of months, kind of on and off, that has made me feel a little bit negative about the medical system and specifically psychiatry in this country. So for background, I am an MD PhD student. That means I'm going to get a doctorate in both MD, which means, becoming sort of a clinician doctor, and a PhD. I'm currently getting my PhD in neuroscience. I'm very interested in the intersection of psychiatry and neuroscience. So, relevant to all of this, I went to a conference back in February called KTGF. That's basically a conference for child psychiatry. But the keynote speaker for this conference was a physician by the name of, and she gave a talk about her research, which is studying brain structure development with a specific focus on people who have a strong family history of later psychiatric diseases such as schizophrenia. So she does a lot of this research in children to see if there are early brain changes before a child would start showing symptoms of schizophrenia that might be predictors of their likelihood of getting schizophrenia or not. And in the course of doing this, she had apparently also noticed some sex differences, and so she was showing us a graph of the development of a particular area of the brain over time for boys and for girls. And somebody in the audience asked if she had taken into account transgender kids, so kids whose gender did not match the sex that they were assigned. And her response to that was to say that in these studies they use something called the CSRI, or the Children's Sex Role Inventory, which asks kids to rate themselves or asks parents of kids to rate their kid on a variety of quote-unquote masculine or feminine characteristics, and then would kind of develop a spectrum of masculinity or femininity based off of those characteristics. I immediately went to go ask a follow-up question on this because it seems pretty self-evident to me and to anybody who understands things about gender expression, gender roles, etc., that measuring masculine and feminine characteristics is not the same as getting information about a person's gender. Because, for example, you can have butch women who present very masculinely but still identify as women, and you can have very femme men who might present very femininely, might do drag, but still identify as men. So, sort of self-evidently, these two things are not the same. And my questions were more or less ignored during the talk, and that's partially just because there was a limited time frame and partially because I think she just didn't want to get into it. So I sent her a follow-up email because I couldn't let this go, and I was like, first of all, this is bad science because she's saying that she's measuring some effect of sex or gender and kind of getting those two confused. But then the thing that she's measuring is some kind of nebulous metric of masculine versus feminine characteristics, which measures a whole bunch of different grab bag of traits that probably don't track with like any kind of gender identity or sex assigned at birth or anything like that. And so I sent her an email, and she responded trying to set up a meeting, which I agreed to. I, on the recommendation of one of my friends, because I was really nervous, reached out to an ally in the field who agreed to join in on this meeting. I'm very grateful to him. So we set up a meeting. This was about a month ago. And we show up to this meeting over Zoom, and she immediately says that she has an emergency and has to go. The emergency ended up being sort of a legitimate thing, even though I was kind of miffed about it at the time. So we rescheduled the meeting for today, May 24th. And this time she did not bow out of the meeting. We actually had the meeting and got to talk about what had happened what she had said during the conference. And a couple of things came to light. First of all, it turns out that she had misspoke when she said that the children's sex role inventory was at all related to the sort of boy-girl categorization that we were seeing on that graph. She said, like, for that, she just uses sex assigned at birth, and separately, she measures masculine versus feminine characteristics and correlates them with some metrics of brain development. So, on the one hand, I was like, okay, so you're not using this to, like, try to assign a gender category to these kids. You're using it for something else. But then my question was like, well, why are you using this? And brought up some of my concerns about, this isn't measuring gender. It's not even really measuring masculinity and femininity. I mean, I'll put up an image of the children's sex role inventory, which is, by the way, from 1991, and is based off of the earlier BEM sex role inventory from 1974. So, very old, very outdated. But I'll put up some of the characteristics here. And under masculine items, it says, like, I am sure of my abilities. I am a leader among my friends. I like to think about and solve problems, which all of those don't seem like, they seem like they could apply to anyone, and the only reason why they might apply to boys more than girls is because boys are encouraged to do those things. But even so, there's, like, massive overlap. And then feminine items are like, I am a warm person, I'm a kind and caring person, I'm good at understanding other people's problems, I'm faithful to my friends. Again, those can overlap, and the only reason they might not overlap is because of societal pressure to do not that thing. But the other issue with all of these things being categorized as masculine or as feminine is that they're measuring a lot of different aspects of somebody's behavior and, like, putting them all into a masculine bucket or a feminine bucket. And so this person was asking what would be a more updated way of categorizing masculinity and femininity, so that, because she agreed that, like, wow, this is really old, we should probably update it. And so she was looking to us to basically just update how she's categorizing masculinity versus femininity. And both of us were responding in a very similar way, like, our understanding of how societal gender roles works has progressed since the 1990s, and you wouldn't be likely to find a scale like this that was modernized, because now the idea is that any correlation between these things in masculinity or femininity is mostly socially constructed, and it would be more scientifically rigorous to study individual metrics of behavior on their own rather than lumping them all into some nebulous metric of masculinity and femininity. So, for example, had given the example of a study she had done where she had used this CSRI to measure masculine and feminine traits, and then had participants participate in a experiment that tested basically social aptitude, and then also used an MRI, a magnetic resonance imaging machine that looks at your brain, to measure the size of their frontal cortex, which is up here. It's sort of like thinking and analysis. So she measured the ventral prefrontal cortex and found that people who scored higher on femininity did better on this metric of social performance, and also had a larger part of their brain called the ventral prefrontal cortex. And she was like, this, how would we report this kind of finding in a way that's more accurate with respect to the, like, femininity angle? And I pointed out, like, a lot of these things that are feminine items are really just measuring a person's social aptitude. Like, how good do you think you are at interacting with other people? So that's kind of a circular logic. You're asking people how good they are at interacting with other people, and then you're having them do a task that tests how good they are in social situations, and then you're measuring their brain. And to me, it seems like what you're actually getting at there is that people who see themselves as a more socially apt person and do better in social situations have a larger part of the brain that you were measuring. So why not just have an inventory that asks them to self-assess how good they are in social situations via a number of questions and maybe like a 1 to 5 scale called a Likert scale, and then have them do this task and then measure their prefrontal cortex, and then your result is like people who, rate themselves as having higher social aptitude have a larger ventral prefrontal cortex. And she seemed to not. The most frustrating part about this is that no matter how much and I put forward this idea that maybe you should measure things like social aptitude or aggression independently and not even relate them to masculinity or femininity at all, she didn't seem to hear it. And she kept coming back to like, what would be a more updated way of classifying this? I think she was still bought into this idea that there's some ground truth about masculinity or femininity that you can measure, as opposed to this sort of being a very socially constructed idea of a large variety of heterogeneous traits that come together and make what society perceives as maybe a more masculine person or a more feminine person. And it was just frustrating in that we said this a number of different ways, and we continued to circle back to the idea that maybe you don't have to categorize things based on masculinity or femininity, especially if, like, I want to cycle back a little bit. Her reason for looking at brain differences between boys and girls, even though what she's really studying is like risk factors for developing schizophrenia or other brain diseases later on, was because she had noticed in looking at brain structures that there were sex-based differences, so differences that correlated with the sex assigned at birth of the kids that she was studying. So she basically wanted to look at those sex-based differences and then figure out what differences in her participants' brains were caused by sex-based differences and which ones were caused by her actual question, which was risk factors for schizophrenia. And that's sort of a very common thing that people will do in science, because in a lot of things there are sex-based effects, so effects that are based off of the sex you were assigned at birth. And sometimes those can mess with your findings about some other metric. And so it can be important to look at those and use statistical tests and metrics in order to kind of even the sex-based effects out so you can look at your actual metric. And so she was just using sex assigned at birth for that. And that is very different from using this whole scale to measure kids on a scale of masculinity and femininity and then correlate that with brain development. To me, it seems like she's actually going out of her way to look at these masculine and feminine traits, as opposed to just saying, like, we saw sex-based effects in brain development, this was confounding our data, so we did this statistical test to basically rule out the sex-based effects and look just at our actual effect of, high risk for schizophrenia or not. This is not at all related to that effort. This is a totally separate thing that it seems like she has decided is kind of her pet project, because she told us like she never had any intention or any funding to study sex differences or gender differences. Seems like she just decided she wanted to do this. And then because she'd done so many research papers that involve this children's sex role inventory, and she has so many findings that are based off of it, I think now she's very invested in the idea that masculinity and femininity have to be a real thing that you can measure. Otherwise, what are these things that she's published? Whereas, like, not only is that incorrect as far as, like, you can't actually measure masculinity and femininity, you're actually measuring a bunch of different things. It's also bad science, because you don't know at the end of the day what it is you're measuring. when you are saying somebody scores high on femininity and then saying an area of their brain is larger or they do better in X situation, are you measuring some ground truth about femininity, or is that being driven by one of the characteristics that you've thrown into the feminine bucket? Is that being driven by their compassion? Is that being driven by their loyalty or their, ability to adapt to different situations? Like, what? It's bad science because you don't know which aspect of this nebulous thing that you're calling femininity is actually driving your result, because it could be any number of these things that you threw in there and is probably not this nebulous thing that you're calling femininity. And the same thing for masculinity. So in the end, and this is my big problem with a lot of her research, is that it seems like when you're using metrics like this, you don't know, you're not measuring what you think that you are measuring. You are measuring something, but in the end, it's probably not the direct correlation of femininity is X that you think. You are probably measuring something tangential to that or something else entirely. But the meeting ended after about 20 minutes, where she said that she had another meeting to go to and reiterated that she wanted to find an updated version of this sex role inventory that was just retooled for the 21st century. I don't know that I feel angry necessarily. I just feel like dejected that there are elements of psychiatry that are definitely like this. And it's not that I didn't know that. I know that psychiatry does have a lot of people who are very invested in outdated ideas of either intelligence or gender roles or what have you. It just is so frustrating to interact with somebody who holds those views so strongly and who refuses to listen to people who are telling her that maybe she ought to reconsider. And that, a lot of research is going to continue to be driven by these outdated views of masculinity and femininity. And a lot of that research, because it's kind of gender is kind of a hot button topic. A lot of research that says masculine people are like X and feminine people are like Y gets picked up by the media so that people can talk about it, because people want to talk about it, and it gets used by transphobes, it gets used by homophobes, it gets used by just bigots in general, or people who are well-meaning but misunderstand what the research is actually saying or what elements have gone into this like children's sex role inventory. And it's used to say like, these characteristics are innate and you can't change them, or it's used to say sexist things like, oh, women are just better at this but they're worse at this. It's used to justify a lot of really shitty elements of society, not to mention it's not good science. The big takeaway is that you can't measure masculinity and femininity. It would be much better to just look at the individual characteristics like aggression or social aptitude that you want to look at and not correlate them with gender at all, but just look at those independently of any other assumptions about that kid's gender roles, gender presentation, anything like that. That is all for today. Just be wary when pop science stuff comes out and says things that is based off of gender or gender identity or gender roles, and always delve into what that means and what kind of research has gone into those claims. All right. Have a good rest of your day.